Imagine, for a moment, that you are sitting inside a 30-ton box of welded steel. It is pitch black. The air smells of sweat, diesel fumes, and raw fear. Beneath you, the floor is pitching wildly, throwing you against cold metal bulkheads. But you are not driving across a battlefield. You are floating in the middle of the English Channel, completely surrounded by angry, freezing ocean waves. You are miles away from the shoreline, and the only thing keeping you and your 30-ton steel tomb from plunging to the bottom of the sea is a thin wall of rubberized canvas. One tear, one massive wave, or one stray bullet, and you will sink like a stone in less than 10 seconds. This was the terrifying reality for the crews of the Sherman DD Duplex Drive tank. It was, without a doubt, the most audacious, borderline insane engineering gamble of the Second World War, to understand why Allied commanders would order thousands of men to drive heavy tanks into the open ocean. We have to rewind to the darkest days of the war, to a shoreline bathed in blood, where a hard lesson was learned at a terrible cost. By 1943, Adolf Hitler had transformed the coastline of Western Europe into a fortress. The Atlantic Wall stretched for thousands of miles, a formidable barrier of reinforced concrete bunkers, pillboxes, and thousands of lethal beach obstacles designed to rip the bottoms out of landing craft. The Allies knew that to liberate Europe they would have to breach this wall, but they also knew the horrific cost of failing to do so properly. In August 1942, an Allied force, mostly made up of Canadians, launched a raid on the French port of Dieppe. It was an unmitigated disaster. The infantry were pinned down on the pebbled beaches, slaughtered by German machine guns. The tanks that were supposed to support them either never made it to the beach or were trapped on the seawall, their tracks spinning uselessly on the loose stones. The Dieppe Raid proved one absolute, undeniable fact. If the infantry landed on the beaches of France without immediate, heavy, armored support, they would be annihilated. But this presented a nearly impossible engineering paradox. How do you get a massive, heavy tank onto a heavily defended beach at the exact same moment the infantry lands? If you bring them in on large landing craft, those ships become massive slow-moving targets for German artillery. If the landing craft are destroyed before they drop their ramps, the tanks are lost, and the infantry are left defenseless. The tanks needed to arrive under their own power. They needed to swim. Enter a Hungarian-born engineer named Nicholas Straussler and a brilliant, eccentric British military officer named Major General Percy Hobart. Hobart was the commander of the 79th Armored Division, a unit entirely dedicated to solving the bizarre, highly specific mechanical problems of an amphibious invasion. His collection of strange, specialized vehicles became known affectionately as Hobart's Funnies. But Straussler's idea was perhaps the funniest and the most dangerous of them all. Straussler understood the basic physics of buoyancy. It doesn't matter how heavy an object is, if it displaces a volume of water that weighs more than the object itself, it will float. A Sherman tank weighed roughly 30 tons. To make it float, you didn't need to make the tank lighter. You just needed to drastically increase its volume without adding much weight. Straussler's solution was both elegant and terrifying. He designed a collapsible screen made of heavy, waterproof canvas. This screen was attached to a boat-shaped platform welded right around the hull of the Sherman tank. Inside this canvas screen were 36 vertical rubber tubes. When compressed air from cylinders on the tank was pumped into these tubes, they inflated, raising the canvas screen over 3 feet above the top of the tank's hull. Suddenly, the dense steel block was transformed into a large canvas bathtub. To move through the water, the tank's engine was modified to power to rear-mounted propellers. This dual capability, driving on land with tracks and moving through water with propellers, gave the tank its name, Duplex Drive, or DD for short. When military brass first saw the prototype, they thought it was a joke. Watching a 30-ton war machine bobbing in the water like a giant canvas duck defied logic, but the tests proved it worked. It could achieve a speed of about 4 knots in the water, and once it hit the shore, the crew could instantly deflate the screen, dropping the canvas in seconds to reveal a fully armed tank, ready to fire its 75mm gun. The element of surprise would be absolute. German defenders, looking out to sea, would only see low-profile rubber boats approaching. They would have no idea that beneath those unassuming canvas screens lurked 30 tons of American steel. But building the machine was only half the battle. The other half was finding the men brave enough to operate it. The training was conducted in absolute, ironclad secrecy. Crews were brought to Fritton Lake in England, a secluded body of water where they were introduced to their new vehicles. The reaction of the tank crews was almost universally one of sheer horror. Tankers are trained to trust their armor, to feel safe behind inches of steel. Now, they were being told to trust a piece of fabric. The training was brutal and unforgiving. Crews had to learn how to navigate a tank using a small tiller while standing on the back deck, as the driver inside couldn't see anything over the canvas walls. They were issued a terrifying piece of equipment called the amphibious tank escape apparatus, essentially a primitive miniature scuba lung, which told them exactly what the high command expected might happen. If the tank foundered, it would go to the bottom in seconds. The water pressure would make it impossible to open the hatches immediately. The crew would have to wait in the pitch black as freezing water filled the fighting compartment, equalizing the pressure, before they could finally pop the hatch and try to swim to the surface. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, a psychological test as much as a physical one. As June 1944 approached, thousands of these tanks and their incredibly brave crews were readied for the greatest invasion in human history. The gamble was set. All they needed was a calm sea. But the English Channel had other plans. The eve of D-Day, June 5, 1944, brought some of the worst summer weather the English Channel had seen in decades. The invasion had already been delayed by a day due to the massive storm system sweeping across the coast. When Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower finally gave the agonizing order to go on June 6, the weather had only marginally improved. The sea was still angry, churning with 6-foot swells and a harsh, biting wind. For the massive battleships and troop transports, the rough seas were a miserable inconvenience, causing widespread seasickness among the infantry. But for the crews of the Sherman DD tanks, this weather was a literal death sentence. The canvas screens of the DD tanks were only designed to withstand a sea state with waves up to 1 foot high. They were built for a calm, flat approach. Now they were staring down a violent, churning ocean. As the landing craft carrying the DD tanks approached the coast of Normandy, the commanders faced a brutal, split-second decision. Do they launch the tanks into the water thousands of yards out, as planned, and risk them sinking? Or do they bring the landing craft all the way to the beach, risking the destruction of the ships and everything on them by German artillery? On the British and Canadian beaches, Sword, Juno, and Goldand, on the American Utah beach, commanders looked at the towering waves and made a battlefield calculation. Many decided to break protocol. They ordered the landing craft to push in close, sometimes right up to the shoreline, before dropping the ramps. Because of this localized, on-the-fly decision-making, the majority of the DD tanks on these beaches survived the drop. They rolled through the shallow surf, dropped their canvas screens, and opened fire on the German bunkers. The psychological shock to the German defenders was paralyzing. They had expected to shoot down vulnerable infantrymen struggling in the surf. Instead, they found themselves staring down the barrels of 30-ton tanks, rising like sea monsters out of the ocean. On these beaches, the DD tanks fulfilled their exact purpose, providing the crucial, life-saving covering fire that allowed the infantry to break through the Atlantic Wall. But on Omaha Beach, the story was a devastating, heart-wrenching tragedy. The 741st Tank Battalion was tasked with supporting the first wave of infantry on the eastern half of Omaha, following their strict pre-invasion orders. The commanders of the landing craft dropped their ramps exactly 3 miles roughly, 5,000 to 6,000 yards, so to sea. As the ramps fell, the tank crews stared out into a terrifying expanse of gray, violently pitching water. One by one, the Sherman DDs rolled off the ramps and plunged into the abyss. Almost immediately, the fatal flaw of the engineering gamble was exposed. The canvas screens were repeatedly smashed by towering waves. The struts buckled under the immense weight of the crashing water. Water began pouring over the tops of the screens, pooling on the steel decks of the tanks faster than the onboard bilge pumps could expel it. The tanks sat low in the water, their engines straining, the drivers fighting desperately to keep the bows pointed into the oncoming waves. But a tank is not a boat. Once a Sherman took on a critical mass of water, the transition from floating to sinking was instantaneous. Out of the 29 DD tanks of the 741st Battalion launched into the deep water that morning, 27 sank almost immediately inside those sinking iron coffins. The nightmare the crews had trained for at Fritton Lake became a horrific reality. As the cold Atlantic water rapidly filled the dark compartments, men scrambled for their escape lungs, fighting panic, floating debris, and the immense, crushing pressure of the deep. Some managed to squeeze through the commander's hatch in the chaotic seconds before it went under. Others waited in the terrifying darkness for the pressure to equalize, managing to escape just as the tank hit the sea floor, 50 feet below the surface. Miraculously, a large number of the crewmen survived the sinkings, bobbing in the freezing water, desperately clinging to inflated life preservers while the battle raged miles away on the shore. But many did not make it out. They remain entombed in their machines on the floor of the English Channel to this day. Because the tanks sank, the infantry on Omaha Beach landed without armor. The resulting massacre was the bloodiest chapter of D-Day, a brutal testament to exactly why the DD tanks were needed in the first place. Yet, History's judgment of the Sherman DD tank is complex. It is easy to look at the tragedy at Omaha and write off the Duplex Drive as a catastrophic failure, a flawed invention that cost brave men their lives. But that is only half the story. Where they were deployed successfully at Utah, Sword, Juno, and Gold, they were absolute game changers. The sight of armor rolling out of the sea shattered the German defensive lines and undoubtedly saved thousands of Allied infantry lives. Later in the war, the DD tanks would be used again, crossing the heavily defended Rhine River into the heart of Germany itself, proving their worth in calmer waters. The Sherman DD was born from desperation. It was a mechanical compromise, forcing a machine built for the dirt and mud of Europe to conquer the untamed violence of the ocean. It was imperfect, it was fragile, and it was incredibly dangerous. But the true legacy of this risky engineering gamble does not lie in the canvas, the rubber tubes, or the propellers. The true legacy lies in the men who climbed into those steel boxes. They knew the risks. They knew the canvas could rip. They knew the sea was too rough. But when the ramps dropped and they stared out into a freezing, violent ocean, they engaged the gears, revved the engines, and drove forward into the deep.